Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. So Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And today we have Dan with us. But Dan, before we take off, we need to know, are you prepared to engage?
So prepared.
Let's do this. Let's go. Because Dan Bennett, he leads the behavioral science practice within Ogilvy. I never know how to pronounce you guys' name.
There's actually a video on YouTube that helps people pronounce Ogilvy. So it's Ogilvy.
Ogilvy. There you go. Ogilvy Consulting London. Looking after clients from the public and private sectors, and he's a practitioner, speaker, writer, and the creative application of behavioral science to the world's stickiest challenges. And joining the practice in its commencement in 2012, he has worked over 80 of the world's major brands and organizations. If you want to get a lot of details on some of those, I'm going to mention Spotify, Facebook, Unilever, Nestle, Public Health England, Gatwick Airport, etc., etc. And there's a lot more details you can get into if you go to Professor Game and you can look for Dan's episode. All of his intro is going to be right there. But Dan, is there anything that we're missing from that intro that you want to make sure the audience knows before we could take off?
No, that covers it well. The only other thing to mention is that we are months away from our Festival of Behavioral Science Nudgestock, which everyone can sign up to at nudgestock.com, which is something I'd love everyone to know. Fantastic.
Yeah, I've actually been signed up. I haven't attended fully as I would have liked because I've been quite busy lately, but it does the newsletter is fantastic. I get, plenty of good stuff there. And I think it makes a lot of sense for the engagers as well. Remind me, is it still free?
It's still free. Yeah, we're on our 10th year now. So we started Nudgestock in 2013 in a small kind of seaside town when we had a couple of hundred people come together. And now, I think a couple of years ago, we had over 100,000 views. So certainly the pandemic has been helpful for getting us to engage a wider audience.
Amazing. So joins those over 100,000 other viewers watching this amazing content. Yeah. And watching this amazing content in Nudgestock. But Dan, we always like to sort of understand what it is like beyond the introduction, what it is that you do, like in a regular day, week, however you want to go for it. What does Dan do these days, basically?
So I guess that can be answered at several different levels. At the highest level, I combine behavioral science, creativity, and data science to solve some of the world's interesting and important problems with a fantastic team. And at a specific level, I run a team of about 20 different types of psychologists. So we have cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, behavioral economists, designers, creatives, all working together to solve some of those problems, bringing their different lenses to the challenge.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. Super exciting as well. And getting into one of those sticky questions that we always like to make and that get pretty interesting, at least most of the times, we would like to know of one of those occasions when you were working on a project using, behavioral science, as you very know well how to do. And, you were trying to go for something and it just didn't work, or, in the test phase, wherever that looks like. We want to go for one of those fail moments or first attempts and learnings, as we like to call them. Can you tell us one of those stories? And we want to sort of be there with you and learn as much as we can.
I do like that. We do. We have a term for that, which I think we must have borrowed from somewhere, called being flawsome. So every week in our weekly status, we will each share our kind of flawsome moments from the week before, just so everybody knows that kind of failure is okay. There's an example that really surprised us. So a couple of years ago, we were working with a charity in the UK, and that charity goes out. There's a special week where it makes most of its donations, at least 50% of its donations in this 1 week. And on Monday, a lot of kind volunteers go out and distribute the envelopes. And the idea is that you kind of fill it up with spare change and cash along the week. And then on a Friday, one of those kind volunteers picks up the envelope, and then they count the money and they see how successful that weekly charity drive was. And given it was UK wide, we were very lucky that we had the opportunity to try lots of different envelope designs. And we tried 6. We had obviously a massive control. And then we tried 6 different envelopes. And we were all, and this goes to the power of creativity with behavioral science to kind of find new and interesting ways of doing things. The ones that we thought were going to work really well. So in the UK, we have something called gift aid, which is basically if you fill out a couple of details, very short details, then essentially the government kind of puts in a bit to your donation as well. And we all thought that telling people to have kind of that if you fill out some details, the government will put in extra money, that would, at least help increase donations in some sense. When we looked at the results, and these were kind of really robust, statistically significantly robust results, there was a massive reduction in the average donation amount by adding in the chance to give extra money to your donation. And we simply couldn't really get our heads around it. Part of it we thought was, is it crowding out the kind of the pro-social urge? So is it that actually it's not all coming from you and therefore you can't feel great about it? Is it the friction and having to fill out some of the extra details? But that shouldn't be the case because it shouldn't have decreased the amount of donations that were made. So we were really quite perplexed with that. Luckily, we were testing out lots of different envelopes at the same time, one of which was a fascinatingly small change, which was just looking at the affordance cues of the envelopes. So we simply changed the envelope from being a landscape envelope to a portrait envelope and had exactly the same details on there as the previous envelope, and it increased donation rates by at least 10%. So even the smallest things can make the biggest difference, but it isn't always the things that we expect. So we were very pleased we'd tested out a variety of options there.
Interesting. And did you find out did you manage to make any interviews post this experiment to find out what happened with the people who were, being crowded out or whatever happened there by the government idea?
Unfortunately, we didn't get to know. No, we didn't get to figure out why gift aid was such a suppressant. But it was one of those things where, sometimes the rational idea isn't always the one that's going to carry us through. So unfortunately, we didn't get the chance to figure out that one at the end. We have done subsequent tests, and an interesting thing that we've found is that some, if we call them nudges, but kind of behavioral interventions, like uses of behavioral principles to get a desired effect, some combinations of those create kind of what psychologists call Lollapalooza effects. 1 + 1 is 3, 1 + 1 is 5. And some of them together cancel each other out a little bit. So actually the combination of nudges, as we're finding, is not as simple as simply kind of adding them together.
Interesting. That's very good. And understanding that it's not always necessarily about adding more. It's about checking which are the things that are helping and checking if together they work as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite biases I've learned lately is the subtraction bias, which is we are so obsessed with adding things. If we're in the workspace, we're loving to talk about all the things we're adding to the process and bringing to the party, whether a lot of the time effectiveness can be done by taking things away, but it's so counterintuitive and you get kind of so little round of applause for, we're as a species, we kind of love making things and producing things and providing things, that sometimes the idea of kind of providing by subtracting just blows our mind. So I think we've all got to think about what's one thing we can take away. I like to kind of cancel one meeting a day if I can. Wake up in the morning and just see which one is the Jenga block that isn't going to bring down the tower. And often it's made a bit of a well-being difference there.
That's a very interesting principle. We always like to talk about in general, sort of simplifying your approaches as much as possible. And it sort of kind of adds up into this as well, but it's a different way of seeing it. It's like when you have all these things, it's not just about complexity. Sometimes it's even just the sheer amount of things you have. Subtracting them can actually have a positive effect on the whole, Jenga block not falling off and having less weight, at least for sure.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So Dan, let's take a 180-degree spin and go for something actually that went super well, like one of those proud moments that you might want to sort of maybe even brag about. This actually went really well. We went for this worked. These were the results. We want to sort of be there with you and sort of understand, if possible, what were some of the things that you might be able to perhaps attribute some of that success to.
Okay, yeah, this is a really nice opportunity. Thank you. So we had a really, really nice opportunity to work with Kimberly Clark on getting people to wash their hands when they go into a factory and washing their hands when they leave the factory. I mean, we don't need to labor the point of the importance of washing your hands in workspaces to make sure that, that kind of big, terrible things don't happen. So we won't labor that one too much. Initially, we were told that we were going to be working in a chocolate factory. And we were very excited in South America. So we were very excited to be flying over to go and see what a chocolate factory looks like. It turns out there was a translation error. You may be able to tell me which word was translated incorrectly. But actually, it turns out we were landing straight and going from the airport straight to an abattoir instead of a chocolate factory. So I don't know what word is very close in the Spanish language. But needless to say, the team were on their way to a different environment, they thought. When we got there, we were looking at a challenge that existed for over a decade. This hand washing compliance wasn't at a severe rate, but it was at a rate which needed to be improved. And everything had been tried before that you would consider to be a rational idea. So they tried paying people more to wash their hands. They tried paying people less if they didn't wash their hands. They tried grouping people together into teams and saying, everyone on this team doesn't wash their hands, everybody gets fined. So everyone kind of, nudges each other along. And they'd also tried, if everybody together in this group does wash their hands, then we'll also kind of do the right thing off the back of that. And none of it worked. I think they tried, blue lights showing you the germs on your hands, all that type of thing. And none of these kind of rational ideas had managed to achieve what we needed to achieve. And so what we managed to do was send our behavioral scientists across to do lots of observations. Qual data doesn't get the congratulations that it deserves, really, but we spend a lot of time observing the environment, looking for kind of the unseen factors in the environment and the different psychological principles that we could see at play. And one of the things that we realized could be done was an invention. And that invention was a hand stamp. And we invented inside that hand stamp a sticky ink. And it was a sticky ink that took the same amount of time to wash off your hand as the time that you, to be compliant, had to wash your hands for. I think it was just over a minute. So it's quite a sticky ink. So when our guys walked into the hand washing bay, they would have their hand stamped with the sticky ink. And then they would have to wash their hands for that amount of time, for a compliant amount of time, in order to get the ink off their hands. And then it could be checked when they walk through. And there's a bit of a social proofing here, social norming thing, right? That you can't walk around with a stamp on your hand inside the factory. Else we would have known there wasn't, suitable hand washing behavior. And it made a very instantaneous, significant impact. There was a 63% reduction in dirty hands overnight. And that even worked on the night shift. The night shift is typically where you have kind of the dirtiest hands because management aren't necessarily around, and there's lots of unsaid factors about why people kind of rush through in the evenings, etc. And so it was a small hand stamp that made this, for the industry, it's $1 billion problem, because if you found to have dirty hands in the factory, there are lots of government spot checks. There are fines for brand recall, fines for bringing all product back from around the world. You have to close down the factory. You have to clean the factory. There's a loss in production. So it's a very expensive problem. And it's kind of one of those proportionality bias things where it would have been very hard without our kind of full process to walk into that room and say the answer to this is something as small as a hand stamp. But sometimes if we can use the process and use the power of behavioral science and the power of observation and the power of kind of qualitative research to really uncover the things that haven't been tried, rather than all the rational things that have been tried, and then test them and then measure them, sometimes we can have these outsized impacts. Not all the time, but sometimes we can have these outsized impacts that make all the difference. So yeah, that was one of those ones where kind of several years on from that now, we are kind of thrilled that there was an opportunity to really solve an age-old problem.
Quite interesting way of sort of solving a problem with something, again, as you mentioned, as simple as a hand stamp. Like, that was it. All that was needed. No huge need for bonuses or fines or anything along those lines, which tends to be like very, sort of smacks you in the head kind of thing.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be threatened by a fine. Nobody wants to be, getting a bonus for washing your hands. It can be nice to get the bonus, but then it's like, well, it's kind of weird. Actually, just give me the money. I'll just wash my hands every time. It's one of those things that is not obvious, but can have, as you were saying, an oversized way of changing behaviors, which is exactly what you guys were aiming for. And you mentioned, you went in there, you looked at what had happened before, you made all this research, and then you started doing qualitative research and looking at what people were doing. And that sort of brought to my mind a question that we always make as well, is to try to understand if you have some form of a process. I know you have a full team as well. How do you approach these problems and looking for solutions? Do you have a series of steps? How does it work in general?
Well, the kind of overarching steps are quite similar to design thinking. So we're kind of diagnosing the challenge up front. Once we know we have a behavioral challenge, getting from the business objective to the behavioral objective is often the hardest part, to really define the problem that you're overcoming in terms of the things that you want to get people to do. That's kind of the key. Once we've got that how might we get X to do Y statement, it's about diagnosing the challenge. And often there's lots of existing information. Often we're not coming to the challenge that's never been looked at before. We're coming to challenges that have been, looked at many times and haven't been solved. And so there's often lots of existing information that we can kind of interpret through a behavioral science lens. So there's some great models out there that we use to populate, to see, of the different factors that we know that affect whether a behavior happens or not, which ones have been investigated and which ones haven't. So you kind of find where the gaps are. And often there's kind of 2 or 3 gaps that haven't been looked at yet. And then we design a research program to really delve into those gaps. Once we're pretty certain that we've kind of understood the psychology of the situation and we know what are the key barriers we're looking at, we then set to create and kind of design the interventions to overcome those challenges. And then from there, it's about, usually we'd come up with about 3 to 4 different interventions, depending on the channel, but usually about 3 to 4 interventions that then go into testing. And we've really found the testing to be the crucial part as well. So they're the kind of the 3 elements. What's really important about doing behavioral science, we've found, is that creative part. So if you think about, if you go on an airline's website, and you'll be looking at flights and it'll say 2 flights left at this price. And we all know that's using the scarcity principle because we've evolved to desire more what we think there is less of. So when we know there's 2 flights left, that should be harking on our scarcity bias in our heads that we've evolved. Now, what we've found when we've looked at different data sets is that actually 2 flights left at this price tends to perform less well over the years because we get used to it. We kind of adapt to its usage. Now, what hasn't happened in people's heads is that we haven't become immune to scarcity. That's still there. That's been around for millions of years. It's going to be around for millions more. What we have got worn out to is the execution of the scarcity principle. So creativity is super helpful for helping us find new ways of working with the psychology that we have. We say that all behavioral science is understanding the patterns in human behavior. Human behavior tends not to be as random as we think it is. There are lots of patterns there. And by spotting those patterns and giving a language to it, allows us to navigate these situations. And it allows us that when we're kind of designing these new interventions, we're hopefully having fewer happy accidents because we're knowing what it is in someone's head or in a group of people's heads that isn't allowing them to do the behavior and what might help them do that behavior. And then we're designing ways through it, and then we're testing which ways. It really is quite impossible to guess which intervention is going to work. As I mentioned with the charity case study up front, even, after a decade of working in behavioral science, I would have fully expected to have had, some kind of benefit from an economic advantage to donations, something at least, certainly not a significant reduction. And yet sometimes it can be something as small as kind of the orientation of the envelope that can trump things. So there really isn't a power to that, which is why we have, this kind of foundation of behavioral science, and then the creative stage, and then the testing stage. We found it's like a 3-legged stool. If you take any one of those away, it doesn't work as well.
Yeah, the doing each of the things once you get into a process. I don't know. I'm pretty sure this has happened quite a few times. See, like a client says, "Yeah, but we need it faster. What can you just not do so we get there faster?" It's like, no. If we don't do one of these things, you might not get a solution, which is what you're actually craving for, right?
Exactly. There was a really great, I can't remember who said it, unfortunately. It was a great phrase used on LinkedIn of all kind of fields of marketing and innovation and design. It's all precision guessing. Nobody knows the answers, but it's all about precision guessing. And hopefully we're all trying to get more precise together and kind of adding these different disciplines together and kind of solving problems in unique ways. But all anyone is doing is precision guessing. So yeah, I think there probably is a correlation between the amount of kind of insight that we have and kind of the ability to solve it, definitely.
For sure. And one of the things that you mentioned there, which you've found as well as crucial, is the whole testing phase. No matter how much experience you have, you might have some insights into, oh, maybe this should perform better, or, you know, your muscle or your creativity muscle is more exercised and you get more ideas. Which is going to be the idea that works? You know, only testing will tell you. The rest are opinions, as my director likes to say at Ironhack. He says, you know, the rest are opinions. You just look at the data, right?
Yeah. We had an amazing time working in South Africa, you know, on this point. And it was working with fizzy drinks company. And we were looking at driving a certain color of the fizzy drink. So it was the red label rather than the black label, basically. And we had lots of research. We spoke to lots of people to see what are the barriers and what are the potential psychological drivers we can use. So we did observations, we did interviews through a psychological lens, and we did, you know, some surveys, and we had a lot of insight. But the answer that we were looking at was looking at the fridge design. And the idea that happened to work in the end, we kind of tested several ones, was the changing the color of the light bulb inside the fridge. So when we changed the light bulb from white to red, it increased the amount of purchases of the red labeled fizzy drink, which is fascinating, and by quite a significant amount as well. Now, I bring up the South Africa element of it because we were working in townships, which aren't, you know, don't have the most sophisticated point of sale systems to be able to run all the tests that, you know, our industries like to understand. And so what we had to do was, when we were there, like you say, the idea of deadlines were coming up, and we didn't have much time. So we had to think on our feet and kind of round up as many, they're called spaza shops in South Africa. So round up as many spaza shop owners as we can, convince them to trial a different type of fizzy drink fridge. But then also, because the point of sale systems didn't differentiate between the colors of the labels, it was just that fizzy drink brand or not. We then had to, in each of those stores, hire local people to sit and count what was sold. And literally sit in the store and tally when a red one was sold and when a black one was sold, to then put those data together to then figure out the significance testing that we do. So it's one of those situations where, if anyone's ever asking, why don't more people test? It's often because it's really hard. And people often aren't set up for even quite simple tests. And obviously, you know, everyone gets to work in very unique environments so unless we're working on kind of websites, and even then, not you'd be surprised kind of the amount of companies that aren't set up for testing. I'm sure you know, but testing is hard, and but it's very, very valuable. So it is often the stage that is a kind of, you know, it's like manana. Yeah, we'll talk about it later. We'll hit the snooze button on the testing. Let's talk about the fun bits of the foundation of behavioral science and the creativity. That sounds great. But the testing, yeah, we'll talk about it later. But it's often the part we really, really try and get in, because sometimes with these outside impacts, it can be quite hard to kind of, as I said earlier, kind of point to some of these more left field, novel, unique solutions that are incredibly powerful, but aren't as conventional up front and don't have that sense of proportionality to them. You know, the light bulb that changed the sales, the hand stamp that changed the hand washing behavior. And so testing is we can't take away that leg of the stool.
For sure. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And Dan, when using these creativity, behavioral science, and all these things combined, have you found that there is some sort of a best practice, something that, you know, makes your projects go a little bit better or a lot better?
I think one of the key things is the types of, because we get brought into challenges where the classic toolbox hasn't worked or hasn't worked enough. or isn't working over time, we tend to work on parts of the business that don't neatly sit in one silo, unfortunately, because organizations tend to be kind of organized by the channels that they're working on rather than the kind of the overall behavior change discipline. And therefore, we tend to work on projects where there's at least kind of 2 or 3 or 4 parts of the business coming together to make something happen. And therefore, the ability to one of the strongest skill sets that we need to do our jobs is the project management coordination. And part of that is figuring out ways of working that are succinct enough. So we do find that whether we don't do kind of the traditional sprint, kind of, a 5-day offsite with every day being different and getting to the end of the week with a prototype, we don't do that very often. But we tend to find kind of a cycle of about 8 weeks is enough to galvanize people in the organization together, but not enough, not too long that they get bored with it or get distracted by other priorities. 8 weeks, something happening quite frequently, several times within the 8-week period is enough to kind of keep everybody motivated together. As soon as something needs to be done in kind of 3 weeks or 4 weeks, it tends to drop off people's radar. But if we keep these projects nice and tight and collaborative, that tends to be the thing that helps the most. Behavioral science is already a fantastic convener, because often when we're talking about these stickier challenges that haven't been solved yet, there can be some kind of baggage that people bring to the project, right? People have tried it before. They've tried working with other department before and it hasn't worked because of certain, other psychological reasons that might be there. And but what behavioral science does is it kind of gives everybody a new language to speak, which kind of reframes the problem. And no one department comes in as an expert. So it's not like you're going round to someone else's house. You're all going round to, you're kind of meeting in public where you're all learning something new together, all learning a new language, all learning a new skill set. And that's why it's a great convener, because you're not on anybody's turf. And the power to kind of get people to look at a problem in a fresh light is kind of half the battle to get people to believe that a change can be made. If you worked on something for 10 years, or if the organization's worked on something for 10 years and it hasn't changed, it's quite hard to convince people that in the next 8 weeks, we're going to do something that's going to make a change. But that's why, the power of the behavioral science has been a convener. I think we found kind of accidentally, it's been really powerful.
Nice. That sounds like a very good one for sure. And then, if, listening to these questions, maybe you said, I've heard this person, or I'd like to hear this person answering these kinds of questions before, sort of a potential future guest for Professor Game. Does somebody come to your mind when I say this?
Potential future guest. I mean, if you haven't had him, Rory Sutherland is one of my inspirations. So I watched Rory's TED Talks when I was in a university library about 12 or 13 years ago. And I was lucky enough to contact him to get a job in his new behavioral science practice. And we've kind of grown it from there. And he remains the co-founder of the practice and a massive inspiration as, a world leading proponent in behavioral science and applying it to brands. So I would say that Rory would be an absolutely super guest.
Sounds like a very, very good one for sure. And talking about inspiration, you mentioned Rory. Is there any book that you would recommend an audience like this one? Again, I think people who are thinking of using behavioral science in ways maybe like gamification or others, where they could maybe get inspired and see something, or, maybe something very specific, or just general inspiration. I don't know. What does that make you think of?
It makes me think of, so Rory was one co-founder of the practice. And then there was also a man named Jez Groom, who was the co-founder of the practice. And Jez now since left us and started another behavioral science practice. And he's published a book called Ripple. And Ripple is an amazing, warts and all, behind the scenes look at really doing behavioral science work. So whether every time, we hear about behavioral science case studies kind of in the wild or on podcasts, we tend to hear a really nicely polished version where everything goes well. Now, Jez has gone back through lots of kind of our work together back in the day at Ogilvy, and also some work that he's been doing with his current business, and really tell some honest stories about how it really works and some great tips. And so I think that Ripple by Jez Groom and April Vellicott would be a great read.
Sounds like an incredible book to read for sure. Thank you very much for that recommendation. And in the world of, behavioral science and all these things, and creativity, of course, What would you say in your case? Like, what does Dan do great? What is your sort of superpower? That thing that you do at least better than other people?
You're probably going to have to edit out a 2-minute pause. I think about this one, while I go through the long list of things that it potentially could be, obviously. Let me scratch around for that one.
Yeah, like that kind of thing that you would say, well, this is the thing that I at least do better than most other people. That kind of thing where like probably it has to do with your role, and that's why you're doing what you're doing. It's basically that kind of superpower, as we like to call it.
This is where you have the edit thing where it says like 10 minutes later. No, it was. I think someone told me this when I was on a course, and they said you're good at making the complex simple, and I think that's probably a lot of behavioral science, which is there was a time when behavioral science was a bit Richard Dawkins, and now it's become a bit more Brian Cox. I don't know if those references are too UK specific, but basically we're getting a little bit less dogmatic and a little bit more inspirational. And I think a lot of making behavioral science accessible to people is about taking the complexity of it and making it simple. Not too simple that it makes it kind of ineffective, but that people can understand it. And that kind of, I really care about taking behavioral science from the kind of the dusty academic tombs and putting it into the hands of the people that really make a difference in the world, whether that be in the private sector, public sector, or the third sector. And I think that the power to kind of take the complex and make it simple can make a bit of change happen.
Sounds like a very significant superpower and a very important one nowadays. And it's kind of a part of the mission that we're at here is making these kinds of concepts accessible to people. And hopefully we are doing a part of that job alongside Dan and other fantastic people trying to do that as well. So Dan, we come to a difficult question, at least for our typical guest, which has to do with gamification. But in your case, I don't know if you like some form of games, and sports are included as games. Things you do with your kids are included as games as well. Do you have a favorite game?
I'm basically terrible at sport. I used to be a figure skater when I was younger, so I did a bit of that, but I genuinely don't follow much sport. And I do get really into any game that's advertised to me for free on Instagram. And, it'll have a ton of ads in it, but I'm just so addicted. So I do go into all that. But obviously the big one right now is Wordle and Hurdle. And I just love the simplicity of them. And I love the fact that we all do it together. And it's in a sense, a communal experience. I think that's kind of the power of it, really.
Certainly is. Very, very interesting games as well. Thanks for sharing that. And you were talking about before how you sort of test out to manage to get the things to the right place. Every now and then, and that was maybe as kind of a sort of a test. Every now and then somebody just gets a brilliant idea and, goes for it. And it actually works. At least from the little I've been able to read about how Wordle, began, you can call the making a game for your partner. You can kind of call that a test, but I'm not sure that there was any sort of planning behind doing some testing and getting it a lot better for a huge audience as it has achieved at this point. So that is a very interesting case of sort of the unicorn that you see every now and then, right?
And that's what I absolutely love about working in the cross-section between behavioral science, data science, and creativity, because tomorrow, me or one of the team or anyone we work with could come up with an idea that changes the world. And we also may not do that. There's something really addictive about that kind of variableness of what comes out your mouth and the ability to kind of spot the magic in each other's and kind of the rough diamonds that come out of our mouths. There's a great book from Sam Tatum coming out very soon called Evolutionary Ideas. And it's a really great take on innovation and how we tend to think that innovation is about like mad genius and flashes from nowhere and doing new and more, when actually some of the best ideas, whether you know it or not, are built on existing ideas that already exist in the world, and they kind of evolve on top of each other. And so really one of the best things we can do is when we're looking to think about new ways to do something, we should actually, and Sam would be another awesome podcast guest, we should actually be looking at how similar categories and other categories have solved the psychological challenge that we're looking to do, find out how they solved that, and then use that as inspiration from our own ideas. Because often if it's a flash of inspiration from nowhere, that's because your brain's been kind of drinking in over the past few years lots of different stimulus, and then it kind of puts those two ideas together. So, and he talks about how to kind of look at evolutionary ideas in a much more systematic way, so we can have more of those, fewer happy accidents.
Nice. Sounds very, very interesting as well. And Dan, I don't want to take a lot of time of your agenda, or more time at least than we scheduled for sure. So I'd like to know if you have any final words, any final advice you want to give the engagers. Of course, let us know where we can find more about your work and what you guys are doing over there at Ogilvy. So this is basically your time to say, bring it on and say whatever direction you want to take.
I would just love to say that, the behavioral science community is one of the most welcoming, kind, generous communities anyone could hope to be in, I think. And I think there's not many people in the industry that wouldn't give anybody 5 minutes to talk about what they do. And so I think we're all very lucky to have that. It's kind of, in any kind of behavioral science organizations tend to be co-opetition is the phrase. It's kind of competitive, but we kind of really all need each other as well to grow. So it's a wonderful time to be in behavioral science, kind of 10 years into its growth. It's real kind of strong applied growth anyway. And so to carry on that theme of sharing, there's two things that are definitely worth mentioning. One is every year, Ogilvy Consulting's behavioral science practice release our top case studies from around the world. And so we publish it in a document called our annual. So if you search Ogilvy Consulting and the annual, that should come up. And you will be able to look at, I think we published 10 cases this year from around the world with some video components too. So definitely worth having a look at that. And we publish that every year. And then what's really exciting about this year, on the 10th of June, we are having our 10th Nudgestock. So Nudgestock is the world's biggest festival of behavioral science and creativity. We cover lots of interesting topics. We have some amazing speakers. We have Nobel Prize winning psychologists. We have Professor Daniel Kahneman. We've had Richard Thaler. We've had Dan Ariely. We've had all the names. And we've also had kind of top comedic names. We've had John Cleese and Ruby Wax, really kind of representing that creativity side of things. And this year kind of promises to be amazing too. And it's free. And it's going to hopefully be about 10 hours long for our 10th year anniversary. So I'm sure we're all going to be absolutely exhausted by the end of it. But and there's also 9 other Nudgestocks. You can go back onto our YouTube channel if you search Nudgestock and watch them. And there's some great ones. So that's our kind of gift to the behavioral science community to hopefully enjoy.
Sounds like an amazing gift. Plenty of content there as well, as you can tell, engagers. If it's going to last 10 hours, you have 10 hours just of the one that's going to happen.
Some people do watch the whole thing. Some people, I watch the whole thing because I'm there, but some people do actually watch the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. So you have a bunch of content there on behavioral science. I have said this before. We've had other people in behavioral science as well. This is a very close thing to gamification, because actually, gamification, as we were talking in the pre-interview chat, we were saying like, I was mentioning that gamification is actually built on behavioral science. It does have, elements of games and all these things, but in the end, what it is deeply all about understanding people and their behavior and treating it as a science. So behavioral science is definitely there. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's free as well. If you don't like it, you can just stop viewing it. You didn't lose anything. So I doubt that's going to be the case. You're actually going to be scratching for time to find time to look at all of that. So thanks again, Dan, for being with us today, for investing your time in the Engagers, and sharing all that knowledge, all that passion, all those insights that you've had throughout these years. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more interviews with amazing guests like Dan, go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list for free. That way we'll be in contact. You'll be getting information firsthand. And of course, you can also write back through that email as well. And before you go on to your next mission, as I always like to remind you, because this does help a lot spread our message to other engagers like yourself, remember to subscribe or follow. That is also absolutely for free using your favorite podcast app. And listen, of course, to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.